Hello and welcome to our introduction to moral theory. In this lecture, we're going to look at some of the basic general features of moral theories according to our book's authors, Mark Timmons. We're also going to take a look at how we structure moral theories. We're going to look at a couple concepts, and we'll kind of talk a little bit about how we can evaluate moral theories as well. Now, before we dive into this, one thing I want you to consider is your own philosophical views. How did your views come about? Now, you've written about these before this class, and this is a topic that we'll likely return to throughout the semester. I'd like for you to go and view this video, Socrates on Self-Confidence, from Philosophy, A Guide to Happiness. Unfortunately, you can't click on the link that's presented here on your screen right now. If you just do a Google search for that title, you'll come across the video. It's about 24 minutes long or so. I'd like for you to think about how you think about ethics. How do you handle so-called big questions and big concepts like fairness, equality, justice, the good life, respect, things like that? A lot of times when we think about things such as this, we don't initially have the ability to go through and understand where we're coming from, how we got these ideas. Throughout this course, you're going to undertake a philosophical journey. You're going to try to develop a better understanding of why you think the way you do. And your views may change throughout the semester. You may develop new ways to communicate about them as well. But keep these kind of questions in mind as we go throughout this semester, as we look at various moral theories and various moral dilemmas. I think you'll find it to be interesting to see. Now, what does a moral theory do for us? Well, according to Timmons, there are two major aims of a moral theory. The first is the practical aim, the second being our theoretical aim. The practical aim is going to give us something to do. That is, moral theory is going to give us something that's going to be actionable in some way. There are several different things that occur within the practical aim. First, ethical theory should give us some type of decision-making procedure to figure out what actions are right actions. After all, if we have a moral theory which is going to tell us that something is right or something is obligatory, we have a duty to do something, it should be able to give us some ways of making that decision. Now, throughout the semester, decision-making procedures are going to be very important, and it's very important that we identify them and get comfortable with using them. Second, the practical aim of a moral theory is going to tell us how moral reasoning works. That is, it's going to give us some ideas about how we reason. Now, we've seen a little bit of this, some kind of introduction to this with our discussion about critical thinking. But it's going to be important for us to understand in a much more why we think the way we think. Additionally, to know how ordinary folks think about moral issues. Think about moral dilemmas that we come across. If you can't think of any, moral dilemmas are discussed within a typical, say, 30-minute news program. Many are implicitly discussed. We also see people oftentimes make moral judgments. And we need to try to figure out why they're making these judgments. How are they coming to make these judgments? If somebody says that doing something is wrong, why are they saying this? How are they justifying it? Understand the moral opinions held by ordinary folks. Moral theory should be able to give us that. Additionally, it should be able to provide us with an analysis of the meanings of moral terms. So if a person does say something is right or good, what do these things mean? On the theoretical side, a moral theory should be able to give us a criterion of rightness. That is, it should be able to give us something by which we judge whether an action. Now, notice my emphasis on the term action. The right is about action. Whenever we discuss things that we're doing, we should always discuss them in terms of rightness. This is much different than goodness. Goodness is a question of value. Well, we're going to get a little deeper into that here in a moment. But value is going to be remarkably important for us to understand. And we're going to see that there may be relationships between the right and the good. Moral theory should also be able to give us standards on which we can make. That is, these criteria for the right and the good be usable. And then as well, a moral theory is going to help us uncover morally relevant aspects of dilemmas. We're going to be able to kind of pull information out of a situation that we're in that's going to help inform us, those with regards to our analysis of the situation, and perhaps even, back to the practical side, give us ideas about what we should do. We're going to see that the practical and theoretical aims are very closely related. Moral theories are also full of moral principles. Moral principles are just very general moral statements that propose conditions under which an action is right or wrong, or something is good or bad. Moral principles, some people believe, are at the heart of morality. Unfortunately, in this class, we don't have time to go into some kind of newer theories about morality that question the requirement for moral principles. If you're interested in this further, look at the last chapter of Moral Theory, one of your textbooks. A good example, basic example of a moral principle: if you make a promise, you should keep it. When we think about these kind of general moral statements like this, they oftentimes are things that we guide or use to guide us. Many people turn to things like the golden rule: treat others as you would like for them to treat you. Or its negative corollary: don't treat others how you wouldn't want to be treated. Moral principles also establish connections between theoretical and practical aims. That is, that when we have a moral principle, for example, if you make a promise, you should keep it, there's typically something implicit in there about the actions that we may need to take, about the decisions that we may need to make. In this situation, let's assume that I'm confronted with a situation where I can break a promise that I've made. Well, this kind of principle, if you make a promise, you should keep it, gives me some reason or some procedure whether or not I should make a promise, or keep a promise, I should say. As such, we can say that moral principles help to create a unity by providing moral criteria and decision-making procedures. Now, we're going to come across a lot of different moral principles throughout the semester, so keep this idea in mind as we read further. Now, when we look at the right and the good, we're looking at two basic ideas in morality. Again, the right is always going to refer to actions. I cannot stress enough how important this is for you to understand. When you discuss an action, you should be talking about its rightness or wrongness. Now, there's some ways how we think about rightness and wrongness. We think about actions as being either obligatory, optional, or wrong. An obligatory action is an action that, no matter what circumstances we're looking at, is something that we should do. We can therefore say that obligatory actions are right in a very narrow sense of the term right. Optional actions are actions that we could take either way. We could do them or we could not do. If we choose to do them, we could say that it's right to do them in a very broad sense. It may also not be wrong for us not to do them, however. A wrong action is very clearly going to be an action that is never right in any sense. It may not be permissible for us to commit a wrong act. And if we do commit a wrong action, we may need to make certain that we have very, very strong justification for doing so. Typically, moral theories are not going to allow for us to commit wrong actions. Our other major category is that of value. Things have value. Actions don't have value. Actions are about rightness or wrongness. When we talk about value, we're talking about the good. And we could say that things are good in either internal or external sense, or intrinsic or extrinsic. A thing that is intrinsically good is good in itself. That is, it doesn't require anything else to inform its goodness or to make it good. So many people, for example, point to things like happiness or love as being things that they may see as having intrinsic value. Obviously, this is different than, say, things that are extrinsically valuable. Extrinsic value means that it gets value from something else. So let's think about, for example, money. Many people believe that money is extrinsically valuable because it allows us to obtain other things, other goods, as it were. Whether those are goods in the sense of commodities or goods in the sense of things that are good in themselves or externally good. Doesn't matter. This is important for us to understand because when we look at the basics of how the theory develops, of how the theory defines its conception of the good, we need to understand what's its kind of supreme principle of the good. Now, we're going to say that things are either intrinsically good, intrinsically value neutral, or intrinsically bad. If we think that pleasure is intrinsically good, for example, we may think that pain is intrinsically bad. We're going to see that later this semester. Now, when we get to the question about moral versus non-moral value, this is also pretty important for us to look at. Moral value is a condition of worth that's attributed to an agent, to a moral agent, to a person who's acting in a moral or immoral fashion. Only people or agents, moral agents, have moral value. Oftentimes we think about this in terms of praise and blame. A person is generally praised for doing actions that are right, or by upholding values that are seen as good. They may be blamed if they don't. This is different than non-moral value. Non-moral values are going to be things such as happiness, pleasure, life. These are conditions that may be things that have intrinsically valuable. Praise and blame play directly into our conceptions of moral responsibility. That is, we generally think that there's something that comes about from acting in the right or wrong way. So we need to make certain that we have a good understanding of how we may use questions of moral worth throughout the semester. How we can evaluate, for example, that somebody has acted immorally and is therefore responsible for that action. Or credible in the sense of being good, of having done the right action. Now, the question of agency is something that we're not going to have time, unfortunately, to get very deep into in this semester. Agency assumes that a person can choose, to some extent, greater or lesser, either by freedom, through free will, or through some type of deterministic process, to act in a certain way. We're going to get to the question of agency a little deeper in some of the theories that we discuss. Now, when we look at the overall structure of a moral theory, there's a very general structure that Timmons provides us, in which we look at the theory of the right conduct, or our conception of the right, versus a theory of value, a theory of good. Now, when I say versus, I'm not saying that they're in opposition. Typically, they're highly related. And we're going to see some cases where, in some theories, the theory of the right is more dominant than the theory of the good. In other cases, the theory of the good may be more dominant than the theory of the right, or one may inform the other in some way. So as we think about moral theory, and as you think about your own moral worldview, think about how you break down these categories. What are actions that you consider to be right actions? What are things that you consider to be wrong actions? What are things that you consider to be intrinsically valuable, that is, that have non-moral value? How do you praise or blame somebody? How do you define a person as having moral worth? These are important questions, and we're going to see throughout the semester that many philosophers have answered them in many different ways. Now, for us to have these kind of theories, it gives us a lot, but doesn't give us everything that we need. It's also important that we develop a critical analysis of these theories, especially when we start looking at, say, inter-theory comparisons. So I'm going to compare how a consequentialist may look at a situation versus a deontologist. It's going to be very important for me to figure out how I can do this. Additionally, it's important for me to understand how I can identify different principles of a moral theory that may end up making the theory, so to speak, more intellectually robust than other theories. And Timmons gives us these 6 criteria. We're going to see these 6 criteria used throughout the semester. And I urge you strongly urge you, that is, to get very comfortable with these. The first thing we're going to look at is consistency. Do the moral principles that are involved within a theory yield consistent moral verdicts? So if I look at case 1, case 2, case 3, case 4, and so forth, am I going to see that I'm going to get similar answers whenever I apply the theory? Then I look for determinacy. Do I get definite moral verdicts across a variety of cases? Do I get yeses and nos? Are these clear? Are they unclear? We're going to see that in some cases, some theories are going to think this is very, very much a necessary thing. Other theories, however, may say that their lack of consistency or determinacy may actually be strengths. We'll see that a little further. We need to look at the question of intuitive appeal. That is, we're going to argue that a theory should develop and make sense of various intuitively appealing beliefs and ideas about morality. Things such as equality are good. Well, if a theory kind of tells us that equality is not good, then it may act against our kind of intuitive ideas about morality. If we should treat people with respect, if a theory tells us that we shouldn't, the theory is not going to be as robust. We also need to look at the theory's internal support. That is, do the principles, along with facts, logically imply internal support from the beliefs that it proposes? So we look at the logic of the theory. Does it make sense? Does it do the premises? We look at explanatory power. As we try to identify features that can explain more specific moral beliefs to explain why a moral verdict can be made. So when I look at a specific belief that comes out of a moral theory, does it tell me why I should be able to say that an action is right or wrong? If it can't do that, then the theory may not be very worthwhile. And last, are there non-moral beliefs and assumptions that may be able to provide principles that the theory espouses? We look for external evidence to help give us a clearer idea as to whether or not the theory actually has any type of power.